The case of Wade Wilson. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Wade Wilson sat at the defendant's table, his face expressionless, betraying none of the emotions swirling beneath the surface. His neatly pressed suit and clean-cut appearance contrasted sharply with the heinous crimes for which he was on trial. The media had dubbed him a master manipulator, a man capable of charming anyone while hiding his true nature, a monster. The public had followed his case for months, riveted by the dark story that had unfolded. Wade Wilson was charged with a string of violent assaults and 2 brutal murders, each more shocking than the last. What was particularly terrifying wasn't just the brutality of the crimes, but the calculated way in which they were carried out. He had evaded capture for years, living under multiple aliases, blending seamlessly into the community, making everyone believe he was just another harmless man living an ordinary life. Judge Evelyn McCarthy entered the courtroom, her face stern, eyes scanning the room before settling on Wade. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and everyone knew that today she would not hold back. "Court is in session," she said, her voice carrying a gravity that stilled the murmurs in the room. "The sentencing of Wade Wilson will now proceed." At the prosecutor's table, Lisa Moore, a seasoned attorney with years of experience in high-profile cases, stood ready. She had been a thorn in Wade's side from the moment he was arrested, relentless in her pursuit of justice for his victims. To her, this was more than just a case. It was a mission to ensure that no other lives would be shattered by this man. She began her opening remarks with a slow, deliberate tone. "Wade Wilson is no ordinary criminal," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "He is a predator who preyed on vulnerable people, using his charm to gain their trust before mercilessly destroying their lives." Wade's defense attorney, Mark Devereaux, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew the odds were against him. The evidence was overwhelming, but still, he would make one last attempt to sway the judge's final decision. The defense had argued that Wade had a troubled past, that his crimes were the result of trauma he'd suffered as a child, but the jury hadn't been moved by those arguments. They had seen through the facade. The tension grew as Lisa recounted the grisly details of Wade's crimes. Each word she spoke painted a clearer picture of a man devoid of empathy, a manipulator who had woven a web of lies so intricate that even those closest to him had no idea what he was capable of. Then she brought up the victims. Their families sat in the front row, their eyes filled with pain and anger. Wade's first known victim, Sarah Lawson, had been a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had met Wade at a charity event, and within weeks, she had disappeared. Her body was found 6 months later, buried in a shallow grave in a remote forest, her cause of death a brutal assault. The second victim, Michael Granger, had been a friend of Sarah's. He had grown suspicious of Wade and had confronted him. Days later, Michael was found dead in his apartment, his throat slashed, his hands bound in a grotesque display of violence. The room hung on every word as Lisa detailed the horrific nature of Wade's crimes. Every description brought the courtroom back to the nightmarish reality of the case, a case that had left families devastated and a community shattered. Finally, it was time for Wade's defense to speak. Mark Devereaux stood, a grim look on his face. He knew there was little he could do to save his client, but he had to try. "Your Honor," he began, "Wade Wilson is a man who has lived a life of hardship, a man whose actions, while undeniably horrifying, are rooted in a past he had no control over. His upbringing was marred by violence, neglect, and trauma that shaped him into the person he became." But as Mark spoke, the tension in the room thickened. The judge's face remained impassive, but the families of the victims were clearly agitated. The words fell flat, unable to pierce the overwhelming reality of the suffering Wade had caused. When Mark finished, the judge called for a brief recess before the final statements would be made. The courtroom emptied, leaving Wade sitting alone, staring straight ahead, unblinking, as if already resigned to his fate. As the door closed behind the last spectator, Wade leaned over to his attorney. His voice was low, his tone chilling. "They don't know the whole story," he whispered, a faint smile curling his lips. "But they will. The hidden truth." The recess was brief, but for those in the courtroom, It felt like an eternity. People milled around outside, discussing the case in hushed whispers, speculating about what would happen next. Some wondered if Wade's cryptic remark to his attorney had any weight, or if it was just another ploy from a man who seemed to thrive on manipulation and control. Inside the courtroom, Judge McCarthy returned to her seat, signaling the end of the break. Wade's eyes followed her as she adjusted her glasses, her face still unreadable. His calm demeanor unnerved everyone in the room. What did he mean by "they don't know the whole story"? Had he been playing some deeper game all along? Lisa Moore was the first to rise again, addressing the judge with finality. "Your Honor, there is no question in anyone's mind that Wade Wilson is guilty of the crimes he has been convicted of. The evidence speaks for itself. The testimonies from witnesses, the forensics, everything points to a man who carefully planned and executed these horrendous acts. Justice demands that he be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law." There was a nod of agreement from many in the room. The families of Sarah Lawson and Michael Granger sat rigid, their expressions pleading for closure, for a sentence that would finally put this nightmare behind them. Wade's defense lawyer, Mark Devereaux, rose to deliver his final words. He looked drained, almost defeated. It was clear that he wasn't defending Wade anymore, not truly. His final statement was more an appeal to human empathy, a last-ditch effort to humanize the monster in front of them. But before he could utter a word, Wade stood up abruptly, his movement startling the room into silence. The bailiff took a step toward him, but Wade raised his hands, signaling he meant no harm. "Your Honor," Wade said, his voice carrying an eerie calm, "if I may, I'd like to say something before you pass judgment." Judge McCarthy glanced at Wade's lawyer, who looked just as surprised as everyone else, then back at Wade. She hesitated for a moment before giving a slow nod. "You may speak." The room tensed, the air becoming thick with anticipation. Wade stood tall, his posture perfect, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, his mask of indifference seemed to slip. There was something behind his eyes now, something dark, something dangerous. "You've heard the stories," he began, his voice measured, deliberate. "The prosecution has painted me as a cold-blooded killer, a manipulator. And maybe I am. But there are things you don't know, things that no one here has considered." He took a breath, as if savoring the tension he had created, the way every eye in the room was on him, hanging on his every word. "You see, Sarah Lawson wasn't just a random woman I met. She was more than that." His voice lowered, sending a chill through the room. "Sarah and I had history. Long before anyone knew who I was, long before I became Wade Wilson, she knew the real me. She was the first person I ever loved. And when she betrayed me, she sealed her own fate." There was a collective gasp. The families of the victims looked horrified, and Lisa Moore was already on her feet, ready to object. But Wade wasn't done. As for Michael Granger, he continued, ignoring the prosecutor's attempts to interrupt, he was nothing more than a loose end. A nosy fool who dug too deep. But even he doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Wade smiled, a cold, unsettling expression that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. "What matters, Your Honor, is that this isn't over. You can sentence me to life, lock me up, throw away the key. But you'll never truly be rid of me. There are more out there. People like me. People who are smarter, more careful, more ruthless. And they're watching. This is just the beginning." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, and murmurs filled the air as the bailiff rushed toward Wade, forcing him back into his seat. Judge McCarthy banged her gavel, demanding order, but the room had already descended into pandemonium. Lisa Moore stared at Wade, her face a mix of fury and disbelief. Wade, however, sat back in his chair, a smug smile on his face, as if he had just won some twisted game. The judge finally managed to restore order, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "This court will not be intimidated by your threats, Mr. Wilson. Your crimes are heinous, and you will pay for them with the rest of your life." But even as she said the words, there was a lingering sense of dread in the room. Wade's words had left a mark, a shadow that loomed over everyone present. The question remained. The shadow lurking. Judge McCarthy's gavel struck with finality, but Wade Wilson's words clung to the air like a poisonous cloud, casting a long, dark shadow over the courtroom. Even as order returned, the tension was palpable. Wade's cryptic message about others out there gnawed at everyone's minds. His chilling smirk, the suggestion that his influence reached beyond the prison walls, left the people in the room with a cold, creeping fear. Lisa Moore, ever composed, was unnerved for the first time. She exchanged a glance with the lead investigator on the case, Detective Alan Griggs, who sat in the gallery. His hard features had cracked into something resembling concern. He knew this case inside and out, but Wade's final monologue had planted seeds of doubt. Was this just a desperate man trying to scare them all? Or was there something more, something they hadn't seen yet? Judge McCarthy, her face pale but resolute, cleared her throat and spoke. This court sentences you, Wade Wilson, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murders of Sarah Lawson and Michael Granger and the associated assaults. You will be transported immediately to the maximum security facility where you will serve your sentence. The words landed with weight, but even the harshest sentence felt insufficient in the face of Wade's chilling parting words. The families of the victims let out quiet sobs, holding one another as they found some sense of closure. But Lisa knew this was far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that Wade's final words were more than just bravado. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something they hadn't uncovered yet. As Wade was escorted from the courtroom by the bailiff, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, he glanced over his shoulder, eyes locking with Lisa's. His smile widened, and in that moment, Lisa felt as if she were staring into the eyes of someone who had already won. Later that evening, as Lisa packed up her office, the weight of the day's events pressed down on her. She had successfully put Wade behind bars, but the victory felt hollow. His taunt about others stuck with her. Wade had been meticulous in his planning, always one step ahead, always controlling the narrative. Was there really more to his network, or was he bluffing in a final act of defiance? Just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed. It was Detective Griggs. "I can't shake this, Lisa," Griggs said the moment she answered. "We need to dig deeper." "I was thinking the same thing," she replied, already gathering her coat. His threats, they felt real. Griggs's voice was tense. There were details he mentioned, things we never brought up in court. How did he know Sarah betrayed him? We never found any concrete evidence of that, and the prosecution never made that claim. Lisa paused, her hand frozen on the doorknob. He was right. The detail about Sarah Lawson betraying Wade had never been introduced as part of the case. There had been rumors, but nothing solid. "I'm heading to the precinct," Lisa said. "Meet me there. We need to go over everything again." At the precinct, Griggs and Lisa sifted through the files once more, piecing together every bit of evidence they had on Wade Wilson. His criminal history was clean until the murders, but there were gaps, months where his whereabouts were unclear, aliases he had used, connections that didn't quite add up. Hours passed, and just as the fatigue began to set in, Griggs pulled out a stack of letters from Wade's personal belongings. These had been found during the initial search of his apartment, but most had been disregarded as innocuous. Love letters, personal notes, nothing that had seemed relevant to the case. But something caught Lisa's eye. One of the letters, dated just weeks before Sarah Lawson's disappearance, was addressed to Wade from a woman named Mara. The letter was cryptic, referring to some kind of plan, and the others who would be ready when the time comes. Lisa's heart raced. She had never seen this letter before. How had this been overlooked? "Griggs, look at this." She handed him the letter. Griggs scanned the note, his expression darkening. Mara, there was no mention of her during the trial. Who the hell is she? Lisa's mind was already racing. Wade had been calm throughout the entire trial, smug even, as if he knew something they didn't. This letter was a clue, and if the others Wade had referenced in court were real, then Mara could be the key. "We need to find her," Lisa said, urgency creeping into her voice. "If she's connected to him, she could be part of something bigger." Across town, in a dimly lit apartment, a woman sat at a cluttered desk, her fingers brushing over a photograph of Wade Wilson. She was striking, with dark hair that fell in waves over her shoulders, her sharp features illuminated by the faint glow of a single lamp.
Mara.
Her eyes traced the lines of Wade's face in the photo, a smile tugging at her lips. The news of his sentencing had already reached her, but it didn't matter. Wade had played his part, and now it was her turn. She reached for a small burner phone and dialed a number, her fingers steady, her voice low when someone answered on the other end. "It's done," she said, her tone calm, almost satisfied.
"He's in.
"Now we wait." The person on the other end gave a short reply before the line went dead. Mara leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming rhythmically on the desk. Wade had warned them all. There were more out there, more like him, and now, with him locked away, it was time for the next phase. The sentencing of Wade Wilson had only been the beginning. Unraveling the web. The next morning, Lisa sat at her desk, poring over every detail they had on Wade Wilson. Griggs was on the phone, attempting to track down any leads on this mysterious Mara. But information was sparse. Wade had hidden his life well, leaving behind only fragments that hinted at the deeper connections he had spoken of in court. As she sifted through the letters, Lisa's gut twisted. The more she read, the more it seemed like Mara was not just a lover or a friend, she was an accomplice, or worse, the orchestrator of something far larger. Each letter contained subtle references to other people, shadowy figures who were part of an unnamed group. The messages were coded but chilling in their consistency. There was talk of moving forward with plans and phrases like "once we're in place." Mara had written to Wade as if they were soldiers in some secret war, and Wade was only a piece of the puzzle. Griggs slammed the phone down, looking frustrated. No records of a Mara anywhere that matched the description. Either she's a ghost or she's using an alias. Lisa rubbed her temples. It's more than that. These letters, she's part of something organized. There are others out there and we don't know how deep this goes. Griggs nodded grimly. So, what's our next move? Wade's locked up, but if what he said is true, we've only scratched the surface. Before Lisa could respond, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an anonymous number. She hesitated, then opened the message. It was a single sentence that sent a chill down her spine. "You can't stop what's coming." Unraveling the web continued. Lisa's heart pounded as she stared at the message, the words blurring in her mind. It was clear this had to be Mara. Wade Wilson's cryptic final words, his arrogance even in defeat, suddenly made perfect sense. He knew something they didn't, Mara, and the others were still out there and they were preparing to strike. Detective Griggs noticed the shift in Lisa's expression and stepped closer. "What is it?" Without a word, Lisa handed him the phone. His face darkened as he read the message. "We need to take this seriously," he said, his voice tight with concern. "She knows we're looking. This Mara, or whatever her real name is watching us." Lisa nodded. "But how did she get my number? And how is she so confident we can't stop them? We need to find out what they're planning." Griggs picked up his jacket. "We should move fast. If she's part of a larger network, we're in for something we haven't seen before. I'll get the cyber team on tracking the message, but it's likely a burner phone." As Griggs walked out, Lisa sat back down, her mind racing. She had been in tough situations before, but something about this case felt different. It wasn't just about justice for the victims anymore. They were now trying to prevent something that could spiral out of control. If Wade was just one piece of a larger operation, what were the others capable of? And more importantly, what was Mara planning? Hours later, Lisa found herself in a cramped room at the precinct, walls lined with whiteboards covered in notes and photos. Griggs had gathered a small task force to review every lead. But for every piece of information they uncovered, there seemed to be two more questions. Wade Wilson was always the public face of this case, Griggs explained, pointing to a timeline of events. But we never really looked deeper into his background. What if Wade wasn't the mastermind? What if he was just a pawn in a larger game? A silence settled over the room as the gravity of the situation sank in. If Wade was simply one cog in a more significant machine, it meant they weren't dealing with just a deranged killer, they were dealing with something organized and potentially far more dangerous. One of the officers chimed in. "We've run searches for anyone matching Mara's description, but nothing's come up. It's as if she doesn't exist. She exists, Lisa said, her voice firm. We just haven't found the right way to track her. Wade didn't operate in a vacuum. There has to be a trail. Financial transactions, phone records, something. Griggs nodded in agreement. Start combing through everything again. We missed something the first time. I'll get the feds involved. They'll have more resources. As the team got to work, Lisa's phone buzzed again. Her stomach flipped as she glanced at the screen, but this time it wasn't Mara. It was a restricted number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? There was a pause on the other end, and then a voice she didn't recognize, calm, measured, but undeniably threatening. You're digging too deep, Lisa, the voice said. Stop now, or the next victim's blood will be on your hands. The line went dead before she could respond. Lisa sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her mind raced, piecing together the cryptic threat. Whoever was behind Wade and Mara's operation had just made themselves known. But it wasn't just a vague warning, it was personal now. The message was clear. If Lisa continued her investigation, innocent lives would be lost. Griggs noticed the change in her expression the moment she lowered the phone. What happened? Lisa relayed the call, her voice steady, but laced with tension. They know we're onto them. They've been watching us, maybe even from the beginning. Griggs swore under his breath. We need to secure you. If they're targeting you. No, Lisa interrupted. We can't back down. If we do, they'll escalate. Whoever's behind this isn't just going to stop at Wade. This is bigger, and they want us to know it. Griggs ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. We don't know what we're dealing with, Lisa. These people are ghosts. They could be watching you right now, and you wouldn't even know it. That's why we need to move quickly, Lisa insisted. Before they strike again. The next few days passed in a blur of heightened security and dead-end leads. Lisa and Griggs worked around the clock, digging into Wade's past, looking for anything that could connect him to Mara or the shadowy network they suspected was lurking behind him. Then late one evening, a breakthrough came. Griggs had been reviewing the financial records of Wade's known associates when he stumbled across something that had been overlooked: a series of untraceable cryptocurrency transactions linked to an offshore account. The amounts were significant, too large to be a coincidence, and the timing lined up with key dates in the investigation. Griggs called Lisa immediately. We've got something. Wade wasn't working alone, there's a money trail, and it leads to an account under a shell corporation. We're still trying to figure out who's behind it, but this could be the lead we need. Lisa's pulse quickened. This has to be Mara or someone connected to her. If we can trace the funds, we might be able to find out where she is. Griggs was already ahead of her. I've got the feds running it now. We should have more information by morning. But the morning didn't bring answers, it brought terror. Lisa woke to a loud knock at her door. Groggy and disoriented, she stumbled to the entrance, still half asleep. When she opened it, Griggs was standing there, his face grim. You need to come with me. Now. What's going on? She asked, her heart hammering in her chest. There's been an attack. Someone's sending a message. As they drove, Griggs filled her in. An explosion had ripped through a downtown office building early that morning. The building housed several legal firms, but more importantly, it had been the headquarters for one of the financial institutions they had been investigating in connection to Wade and Mara. They're covering their tracks, Griggs said, his voice tight with anger. Whoever's behind this is erasing any connection we might have had to them. And they're willing to kill to do it. Lisa felt a sickening realization settle over her. This wasn't just about Wade Wilson anymore. They were up against something far more dangerous, an invisible network willing to go to any lengths to remain in the shadows. And now, it seemed, they were just getting started. Shadows in the dark. The devastation at the scene of the explosion was beyond anything Lisa had imagined. Smoke billowed into the sky, flames flickered from the remains of the office building, and the air was thick with the smell of burning debris. Emergency vehicles crowded the street, their flashing lights casting eerie patterns on the surrounding buildings. Crowds of onlookers stood at a distance, murmuring in shock as firefighters worked to douse the flames. Lisa stood frozen, her heart sinking. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest like an iron grip. Griggs stood next to her, his face set in a grim line as he watched the chaos unfold. They knew, Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of sirens. They knew we were close. Griggs nodded, his jaw clenched. And they acted fast. Too fast. For the first time, Lisa felt a genuine sense of fear creeping into her thoughts. Whoever Mara and her people were, they had resources far beyond what she and Griggs could have anticipated. This was no ordinary criminal network. This was organized, sophisticated, and ruthless. They're not just covering their tracks, Griggs said, his voice low and steady. They're sending a message. This is a warning. Lisa's mind raced. The explosion wasn't just meant to destroy evidence, it was a calculated move to strike fear into anyone who might get too close. And now, it was clear that Lisa and her team were in the crosshairs. As she stared at the smoldering wreckage, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Her pulse quickened as she pulled it out, half expecting another cryptic message from Mara. But it wasn't a text this time, it was a call from an unknown number. Lisa hesitated for a moment before answering. "Detective Ward," she said, her voice wary. A familiar voice responded, cold and distant. "You didn't listen." It was Mara. Lisa's grip tightened on the phone. "I don't take orders from murderers." Mara's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You should have walked away, detective. You should have stopped when you had the chance. Now you're playing a game you can't win." Lisa felt a surge of anger. "You think you can scare me into backing down? You've already lost. Wade's in prison, and it's only a matter of time before we find you." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a chilling response. "Wade was just the beginning. You have no idea how deep this goes. And by the time you figure it out, it'll be too late." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let Mara hear the fear in her voice. "We're not stopping. You can destroy buildings, kill people, but we will find you." Mara's voice softened, almost mockingly. "Oh, Lisa, you're already too late. The next move is already in motion. And this time, the blood will be on your hands." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lisa with a growing sense of dread. She stared at her phone, her mind racing. What did Mara mean by the next move? What was she planning? And why did she sound so confident, so certain that Lisa wouldn't be able to stop it? Griggs approached, noticing the tension in Lisa's posture. "What did she say?" Lisa turned to him, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with urgency. "She's planning something else. Something big. And she wants us to know that we won't be able to stop it." Griggs swore under his breath. "We need to move faster. We need more manpower, more resources." Lisa shook her head. "It's not just about resources. This is psychological warfare. Mara wants to break us before we even get close. She wants us to feel powerless." Griggs glanced at the wreckage, then back at Lisa. "So, what's our next move?" "We need to stay ahead of them," Lisa said, her mind already formulating a plan. "If Mara thinks we're too late, then we need to prove her wrong. We need to figure out what she's planning and stop it before it happens." Griggs nodded. "I'll reach out to the feds, get more eyes on this. But we need to be careful. Whoever these people are, they have eyes everywhere." Lisa took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We can't afford to slip up." "Not now." Back at the precinct, the team worked through the night, combing through every lead, every piece of evidence that might give them a clue about Mara's next move. Lisa sat at her desk, reviewing the case files, her mind racing with possibilities. Then, just after midnight, they found something, a name that had been buried in the background of Wade's financial records. A consultant, someone who had worked with Wade's shell corporations to move money in and out of offshore accounts. The name was Jacob Harris. Lisa's eyes widened as she stared at the file. Harris had connections to a number of high-profile financial crimes over the years, but he had always managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities. He was a ghost in the financial world, slipping in and out of systems without leaving a trace. And now it seemed he was involved with Mara and her network. Griggs leaned over her shoulder, reading the file. "This guy's slippery. If he's involved, it means Mara has serious financial backing." Lisa nodded. "We need to find him. If we can get to him, we might be able to unravel Mara's entire operation." Griggs pulled out his phone. "I'll put out an alert. But we need to be careful if Mara finds out we're after him. She could move faster. Lisa stood, her determination renewed. Let's move before she does. The next morning, they tracked Jacob Harris to a luxury apartment in the heart of the city. The building was high-end, with tight security, but Griggs had managed to pull a few strings to get them access. As they approached the apartment, Lisa's nerves were on edge. This was their first real lead. If Harris was involved with Mara, he could be the key to unraveling everything. But something about the situation felt off. It was too quiet, too easy. Griggs knocked on the door, and they waited in tense silence. A minute passed, then two, but there was no response. Lisa exchanged a glance with Griggs before nodding to the officers behind them. They broke down the door in one swift motion and rushed inside, weapons drawn.